These faces you're looking at are the people behind some of the most infamous true crime cases covered on this channel. In this Twisted Minds compilation video, we'll be exploring each and every one of their cases, proving that evil is not defined by location, and this certainly does not have an age limit. This brings us to our first case, the murder of Erica Green. The story we're going to explore today, the murder of Erica Green, sparked nationwide interests across the United States, as the victim remained unidentified for several years, as long as the case remained unsolved. It was recently discussed in the media. Imagine taking a walk in a park and finding a dead body. Not just a dead body, but the body of a small child, headless and mutilated beyond recognition. This happened in Hibbs Park at 59th Street and Kensington Avenue, Kansas City, Missouri. This story is about the murder of Erica Green, a 3-year-old American girl. What were the motivations, and what could be done in the future to prevent such crimes? What you will find out in today's video will shock you to the core. It was April 28, 2001, when the naked, decapitated body of little Erica Green was found in a wooded area in the city, close to a church. The body was covered with bruises and injuries, as if someone had repeatedly kicked it. Initially, it was estimated that the body belonged to a 3 to 6-year-old child. Almost 3 days later, her head was found wrapped in a plastic bag 150 to 200 yards away from the body discovery site. The initial reports suggested that the body had bruises that may have been caused by constant kicking or hitting with a heavy object, such as an ashtray. Judging by the nature of the cuts on the neck, it was presumed that the head was chopped off using shears or hedge clippers. The police tried to figure out the person's identity but were unsuccessful. There were no reports of a small black girl missing in the surrounding areas. After nobody came forward to claim the girl's body, the story caught the media's attention. She was referred to as Precious Doe. Several volunteers came forward to raise funds for Erica's funeral, which was held in December of 2001. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people. A memorial was also built in Hibbs Park, near where Erica's body was found. Many attempts were made to identify the little girl. This included forensic facial recognition techniques such as police sketches, computer-generated images, and face busts. The investigators narrowed down her age to between 3 and 4 years old. Due to the increased pressure from the public, the body of Erica Green was exhumed 2 times for autopsy purposes, once in 2002 and again in 2003. Despite receiving thousands of tips from around the world and putting a lot of effort into the investigation, they were unsuccessful. One of the activists, Alonzo Washington, never gave up. He kept talking about the case and ensured the investigation never stopped. Every year on the anniversary of Erica's death, he ran an ad in a local African-American newspaper, the Kansas City Call, to remind people of the incident and to encourage people to come forward. He raised $33,000 for reward money in the case. On April 30, 2005, Alonzo was contacted by a man named Thurman McIntosh. He claimed to be the grandfather of a man named Harold Johnson, who lived in Muskogee, Oklahoma. According to Thurman, Harold moved to Kansas City in the spring of 2001 after marrying a woman named Michelle Green. She already had a daughter named Erica Green. When the family moved back to Oklahoma, Erica wasn't with them. Upon being asked about Erica, Michelle always struggled to answer the questions that led Thurman to believe that Erica was actually Precious Doe. On the 4th of May, Thurman was asked after Alonzo forwarded the tip to a Kansas City homicide detective. Fortunately, Thurman was able to provide the investigators with a hair strand belonging to Michelle. The DNA from the hair was a match to Precious Doe's DNA. The police instantly traced the Johnsons and brought them in for questioning, and not long after that, the mystery started to be revealed. On May 5, 2005, it was announced that Precious Doe was indeed Erica Green. The innocent Precious Doe was born on May 15, 1997, in McLeod, Oklahoma. Just a month before Erica was born, Michelle was in prison for larceny. The Mabel Bassett Correctional Center didn't allow children to live with inmates, so she gifted Erica to Betty Brown, a friend of her grandmother. Very little is known about who Betty was. On April 4, 2001, Michelle picked up Erica from Betty's place. She said they were going to have a family reunion. Instead, she moved to Kansas City, Missouri, with her boyfriend Harold Johnson. Initially, Michelle wanted to get a job in Kansas City, but after multiple failed attempts, she lost her faith, got depressed, and started using drugs. In late April 2001, the Johnsons were living in Kansas City. By then, both husband and wife were using PCP, a drug that can cause disordered thinking and delusions. One night when Erica didn't want to go to bed, Harold got angry and started kicking her. That's when Erica became unconscious and passed out. Upon finding Erica, Michelle tried to revive her but was unsuccessful. Considering that they both had outstanding warrants for their judgment, they were afraid to seek professional medical help. Michelle placed Erica's body in a bathtub full of ice-cold water in the hope that she'd regain consciousness. It It was estimated that Erica was unconscious for between 10 hours and 2 days before she died. After the death, the couple hid Erica's body in a baby stroller. Hiding the little girl's body was now the only option for the couple. Harold and Michelle showed absolutely no remorse in disposing of her body. To make things worse, they decided to chop off her head with hedge clippers so that no one would recognize her. Upon reaching the park, they removed her clothes and cut off her head. Only a pair of monsters could do this to an innocent little soul. They threw the head away from where her body was. At that point, Harold and Michelle thought that no one would ever find her. They moved on with their lives as if nothing had ever happened. Every now and then, relatives asked about Erica's whereabouts. Michelle used to tell people that Erica was back with Betty Brown in Oklahoma. She kept telling similar lies for the next 4 years. Erica was never reported missing because her mom always came up with apologies. It was later provided by LaWanda Driscoll, Harold's cousin, that Michelle too was involved in disposing of the body. Once Erica was dead, she put the body in the stroller as if she was asleep and transported her. LaWanda was also present in the home on the day Erica was killed. We could hear screaming in the back bedroom when talking to a local news channel. LaWanda also provided more information about Erica. According to her, Erica was never happy at Harold's place. She was homesick and cried a lot. Harold Johnson would beat the child for crying, for peeing on herself, or if she wouldn't eat, whatever. She even heard Harold tell Michelle, "You'd better go take care of your daughter, or I'm going to do something bad once Erica went missing." LaWanda and her cousin often used to ask about her. But Michelle Johnson always had an excuse for everything, and we believed her at the time. The truth was now out. Erica Green was indeed murdered, decapitated, thrown in a park by her own parents. The Johnsons were charged with second-degree felony murder on May 5, 2005. They were extradited to Kansas City. Harold Johnson was convicted of first-degree murder in the death of his stepdaughter in September 2007. Michelle pled guilty to the second-degree murder charge after she tried against Harold. Eventually, she was sentenced to 25 years in prison on different charges. This included endangering the welfare of a child, murder, abandoning a corpse, and tampering with physical evidence. Upon hearing that Michelle had recorded a testimony against her husband, things got heated between Harold and Michelle, and they both started blaming each other for the murder. According to Harold, Michelle was a bad mother who never cared for Erica. She used to get high on drugs and left Erica alone for hours. In an extreme burst of anger, he told Michelle, "I hope you got run over." The cause of death was reported as a closed head injury. Harold ultimately confessed to the crimes and agreed that little Erica was kicked in the head. According to a neurosurgeon, Erica's life could have been saved if she had gotten professional medical help immediately. In November, Harold was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Up next is the story of Fidel Lopez, the maniac who gutted his girlfriend in a drunken rage. Maria Nemeth's case is one of the many classic homicide cases rife in the United States. The country has a well-documented history of violence compared to other developed nations. It's astounding how many people continue to believe the United States facade as a saint's nest or God's own country. Instead, it's a place where deviant, violent cultures are encouraged through media, legislation, privilege, and freedom. This brings us to the sad and gory details of Maria Nemeth's homicide. It's time to play our game of who'd done it and why. To her neighbors, Maria Nemeth was among the sweetest, kindest people they had ever met. She was well loved and had a great reputation. According to Dan Carter, Nemeth was a very gentle, very private, soft-spoken young lady. We all loved her, a very pleasant young lady. Another neighbor, Debbie Katz, also backed up this sentiment, describing the deceased as a very sweet, loving girl. Been here for years. I've been in and out of the office for 8 years. Before her demise, Nemeth was employed as a leasing agent for an apartment complex. She met Fidel Lopez at a club during that time, and the two fell in love. Nemeth was a Peruvian native who moved to the United States in her teenage years, settling in Miami-Dade County, South Florida. She took up several jobs over the years, including office and retail gigs. Fidel Lopez, on the other hand, hails from Havana, Cuba. He left his hometown for the United States when he was only 15 or 16 to join his father, who was already in the country. At the time of his arrest, Lopez worked at the 595 truck stop on 2705 Burris Road, Davie, Florida. When the business was contacted, the managers stressed that Lopez was a temporary hire with a few days on his contract. Broward court records revealed that Nemeth had left a marriage previously, which unfortunately was a factor in her death. In April 2007, she tied the knot with a man named Norbert in a religious ceremony held in Boca Raton. They were married for 8 years before splitting up, however. They weren't officially divorced, merely separated. So, when news of Nemeth's death reached Norbert, he declined to comment but implied that he or the deceased's family might make a statement eventually. Maria's new relationship with Lopez was only 1 year in when tragedy struck. At the time of their meeting, Lopez had 2 kids, and he was living with their mother. As the relationship grew over time and became more serious, Nemeth and Lopez decided to move in together. First, they found a place in Hollywood, then relocated to Hialeah to put up with Lopez's family as they searched for a new place. In a twisted turn of fate, they found and paid for a place at Colonnade Residences in Sunrise. Nemeth was the leasing manager of the apartment complex, so they easily moved in. Then, a week into their stay at the new place, Lopez returned home from the truck stop to Nemeth, who'd done some cooking. The couple had rice, chicken, and beans for dinner before driving up to Hialeah to meet and spend time with Fidel's mother. Lopez recounted that he took Nemeth to a Chili's restaurant the same night, where they ordered some margaritas before making another stop at a BC Fine Wine and Spirits. There, he got them a bottle of tequila, which they took back to their house in Sunrise. Since they were fairly new in the apartment, the couple hadn't gotten around to getting furniture, so they made a makeshift table using several cardboard boxes. That same night, they did some tequila shots, even cutting some limes and garnishing with salt. All the while, they blasted some music on a cell phone and downed half the bottle. All seemed to be going well until it was not. Lopez caught a blinding rage that saw the sliding glass door and closet door torn down, while the drywall took several punches that left holes in it. Lopez claimed that he was too stoned to remember what sent him on a hulking spree in the first place, but he did remember that he and Nemeth had the roughest sex inside the closet. In their drunken haze, the couple wound up in the bathroom because Maria Nemeth felt nauseous. "I just remembered seeing glass on the floor. I really don't remember when I broke it or why did I break it," Lopez reported to investigators. He claimed to have stepped out almost immediately for a smoke but returned to find Nemeth barely breathing on the bathroom floor. A decent argument if the deceased wasn't found with her vaginal canal sprawled out all over the floor, or with the intestines completely torn out of her body. Yeah, things are about to take a turn for the worse. It's 3:39 a.m. when the 911 line buzzes. An operator jumps on the call to hear a frightened Lopez whimpering at the other end of the line. She's not breathing, he cried. She's not breathing. Send the ambulance, sure." A couple of minutes later, the Sunrise Police Department had flooded around the Colonnade residence. They made their way to the couple's apartment, where they found Lopez wailing over Nemeth's nude body in the bathroom. Blood had puddled near the corpse, and body tissue stretched from the deceased's nether region. The crying man rang 911, and a dead woman turned inside out seemed like something out of the illegal abortion handbook, or so the detectives thought until they tried to get Lopez's statement. His account and the disarray of the apartment told a different story, though. Bloodstains were all over the apartment, not just the bathroom, bedroom, closet doors and walls. The broken sliding glass and the door torn clean off its hinges further spurred suspicion of foul play. Some 30 minutes into their arrival, Nemeth was pronounced dead by the Sunrise Fire Rescue Department. Detectives searched for clues around the house and happened on the half-empty bottle of tequila that started the night and slices of lime, tying in several indications of a scuffle. Upon reaching out to the neighbors, 2 claimed to have heard a lot of noise, with a man yelling at the top of his voice for about 2 hours before all went quiet. Lopez was brought in for questioning the following day, a Sunday morning, to recount his side of the story. He began by revealing their sex disaster in the closet before Nemeth made her way to the bathroom, where she was subsequently puking and collapsed. When asked about foreign objects in her body, Lopez clarified that Nemeth had talked him into trying beer bottles as an adult toy. Surely no woman in the history of sexual encounters has ever encouraged a guy to take out his phallus and instead stuff her with bottles. Well, let's just see how this holds up in court. Fortunately, the detectives didn't buy the story and pressed Lopez for more details instead. He finally caved and described in gory detail how he snapped and murdered his girlfriend of 1 year. All seemed to be going fine when they were making love until Nemeth made the murder-worthy mistake of calling out her ex-husband's name twice. Lopez flew into a rage. "She changed my name," he told detectives. "That's not really how the change of names works, but okay, she called me the name of the other guy, and she said it twice, and she was wrong, and she was confusing me with him." According to Lopez, he stepped out of the closet and started breaking things around the house. The rear sliding door was his first victim, followed by the drywall and the closet door because, the house is to blame. Upon returning to the closet, he found that Nemeth had collapsed and was unconscious. Horrifically, Lopez grabbed some beer bottles and started inserting them up Nemeth's vagina, not looking quite as stuffed as he was hoping for. Lopez went ahead and added a flat iron for hair, just to make sure everything was in the right place. He rammed both of his arms up there to his elbow, felt around for her intestines, grabbed and pulled them out. Lopez added that Nemeth didn't move while he rearranged her insides, and so he grew worried. So he fetched some water and splashed it on her face. Then, when she remained unconscious, he moved to the bathroom to wash off his bloodied hands before stepping out on the porch for some cigarettes. "I was so nervous, man," he told investigators. "I wasn't thinking, man, I wasn't thinking." Upon returning to the bathroom, Lopez found that Nemeth's corpse made for solid aesthetics, so he grabbed some nearby items to cover up the tissue he'd yanked out. Finally, he checked to see if she was breathing again before calling the authorities. After confessing to how he violated Nemeth, Lopez tried to get some clues from the investigators. "I know I'm going to jail, but I have 2 kids, you know. How many years do you think this is going to cost me?" By the afternoon of the same day, Fidel Lopez was arrested on the charge of first-degree murder. He was held without bond, and there were no legal protests from his attorney. Records failed to indicate if he even hired one. Lopez's only other legal misconduct was for disorderly intoxication in 2014, as shown on the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. After meeting with his attorneys, Lopez was ready for his court appearance, and a Broward judge set February 13, 2016, as the date for setting up the jury. Melissa McNeil, a defense lawyer, commented that the move for a speedy trial was made for only one reason, although it was waived more times than used. She ended by saying, "We are ready for trial." Luckily for him, his timing for a speedy trial was beneficial to his case, which had 2 counts of sexual battery and first-degree murder. So tabling the case to a jury as quickly as possible prevents the state from initiating the death penalty. Before now, Florida's strategy for using the death sentence was deemed unconstitutional and subjected to further verification processes. Within that time, Alona Holmes, a Broward Circuit judge, placed a formal inhibition on the state attorney's office from pursuing the death penalty. Tom Coleman from the prosecuting counsel declined to comment on the state's decision to appeal the ban. Jury selection began in earnest on the due date, and a time was set for the panel to return to court and hear the confession that Lopez had provided to the Sunrise Police Department. A week before Lopez's court appearance, the defense lawyers filed a motion arguing that he wasn't read his Miranda rights properly, hence, he didn't understand his rights during the interrogation process. The defense also hoped to lower the amount and type of crime scene photos that the jury got to see, for fear that the gruesome images may spark unnecessary outrage. This way, the case would be decided based on sentiments instead of facts of the incident. The judges routinely compromised, with Holmes choosing the photos of the crime scene that the judges got to view. As for the speedy trial, Lopez was arraigned in a Broward courtroom on October 19, 2015. He was brought in wearing handcuffs and striped jail clothes. His deposition was rather stoic for about an hour until Christopher Pittman, the attorney representing him, promptly pulled out of the case. Another Broward Circuit Court judge, Lisa Porter, filed for a new public defender to represent the accused. "A not guilty plea has been entered on your behalf," Mr. Lopez Porter remarked. It turned out that Pagan and other public defenders on his team, including Caroline McRae and Jose Reyes, had confided in Lopez about a change of representation before his arraignment. Lopez remained behind bars without bond until his next scheduled court hearing on December 10, 2015. This time he was convicted guilty to charges of sexual battery and murder of his 31-year-old girlfriend, Maria Nemeth, in a Broward County courtroom. Owning up to the crime was part of his plan with the prosecutors. The court was adjourned to August 3, 2016, for his official sentencing, where he would serve a life sentence with no parole instead of being served the death penalty. Up next is the tragic case of Christopher Pittman, the 12-year-old who killed his grandparents. The date is the 28th of November 2001. The peaceful rural city of Chester, South Carolina, wakes up to the most dreadful news: the house of one of their oldest residents has burned to the ground. Earlier that morning, at about 1:40 a.m., firefighters rushed to the scene of the incident and worked tirelessly to put out the fire. They believed at the time that the house was empty, but when the flames eventually subsided, what they found shook them to the core. They found the bodies of 66-year-old Joe Pittman and his 62-year-old wife, Joy Pittman. But it wasn't the fire that got to them, and it definitely wasn't the smoke. Someone diabolical had shot this old couple to death right before setting their house on fire. The Pittmans had been loving and responsible members of the Chester community for several decades, and their 12-year-old grandson, Christopher Frank Pittman, was also staying with them. But where was he? The 12-year-old's body wasn't in the burnt building, which was a relief. Had he been kidnapped? This was one of many questions that the police had to answer when they arrived at the crime scene. Christopher Frank Pittman was missing, and to make matters worse, his grandparents' Nissan Pathfinder was also nowhere to be seen. Someone had taken it. Was this another case of premeditated murder, arson, and kidnapping? Could it be that the perpetrators of this horrible crime had killed the grandparents, kidnapped the 12-year-old grandson, burned the house to the ground, and made away with the truck? To the dismay of the cops, the case was getting complicated quickly, and at the same time it was quickly becoming a mystery. However, nothing would prepare them for the truth. This was a case so bizarre that by the time we are done, you might be left with more questions than answers. To properly understand this case, and the senseless murder of Joe and Joy Pittman, we have to go back to the 9th of April 1989, the date of birth of Christopher Frank Pittman, Joe and Joy's grandson. He was born in Florida to a dysfunctional couple. While his mother was negligent, irresponsible, and absent from his life, his father, whose name was also Joe, was going through a rapid series of bad relationships. It was also reported that Chris's father was violent to him when he was a kid, but we will address that as we move forward with the story. Christopher had an older sister, Danielle, and together they had to endure the chaos of their childhood. However, when things got unbearable for Chris, his grandparents had to step in. Joe Pittman was Chris's paternal grandfather, and everyone who knew him described him as a stern, opinionated man who was also a loving and supportive member of his community. He was a tough man who cared deeply about his faith, family, and music. This was something he could express freely at the local Methodist church in Chester, South Carolina, and he also had a soft spot for his grandson. So when he caught wind of the chaos the little boy was living through, he took him away from Florida and brought him to live with him and his wife in Chester, South Carolina. The change turned out to be the perfect cure for Chris. At first, it was clear to everyone how hurt the young boy was. The Chester community would describe him as a well-mannered but extremely quiet boy. At the Methodist church, members and even the chaplain noticed how reserved Christopher was, and they did their best to make him feel at home. With time, it worked. Christopher became more expressive, fun-loving, and full of life. He adjusted perfectly and found the stability and nurturing environment that every child needs and deserves to have. However, you know how these stories go, it is often the calmest moments that precede the storm. And in the case of Chris, his life was about to course correctly back towards the chaos of his past. One day, Chris's father came to South Carolina for his son. His mother had returned, and there was a promise of family once again, so Chris returned to Florida with his father. Before we continue, I think it's important to note that everything we have mentioned so far happened to Christopher Pittman before he was 12 years old. Not too long after Chris returned to Florida, his mother disappeared once again. He woke up one morning to find that his mother had left without warning. Around this time, his father was also going through his third divorce, and the pressure became so much that one day, 12-year-old Chris decided to run away. He wanted to be with his grandparents again. He wanted the security and stability he once got from them. But he didn't get that far. The police found him 15 miles from home and brought him back to his father. At home, Chris began to get desperate. He was no longer interested in staying in Florida with either his father or his older sister, Danielle. He threw tantrums, and those tantrums soon turned into depressive episodes. Then one day, things escalated too far when he grabbed a knife and threatened to kill himself in front of Danielle. According to her, he said, "You know, I'd rather die than live in this house with you and Dad." It was this suicidal threat that convinced his father to return him to his grandparents, but it might have been a little too late. Chris had already changed. The community that had once nurtured him into a fun-loving and expressive kid no longer recognized him. Worse still, he had also developed a foul temper. He was getting into fights with anyone and everyone. With classmates, he had an episode where he choked a fellow student on the school bus. In church, things got to a boiling point on the evening of November 28th, when Chris started kicking the back of the piano bench, disturbing the pianist and the entire service. Unsurprisingly, his grandparents were outraged, especially his grandfather, Joe. Chris's grandparents had to leave church early that day, and when they got home, Chris got a spanking from Joe for his bad behavior. Later that night, the Pittmans, both Joe and Joy, were found with bullet holes in their heads, their house on fire, and 12-year-old Chris Pittman, their grandson, was missing. Now that we have come full circle, I want us to pay close attention to the story because this is where things begin to get bizarre. House on fire? Check. Someone calls the fire department? Check. The next morning, the police arrive on the scene. Back in Florida, Chris's father gets a call that his parents' house is on fire, and he immediately travels down to Chester, South Carolina, only to find out that not only were his parents killed in cold blood, but his son was also missing. By that time, the search for his son was already underway, and it wasn't long before he was found. Christopher Frank Pittman was found in his grandparents' truck by two deer hunters in the woods some miles away from his grandparents' burnt home. The truck had broken down, and Chris told them that he had been kidnapped by a big black man who had shot his grandparents, burned their house, and kidnapped him. The deer hunters were inclined to believe him, but something was off. The 12-year-old boy was eerily calm. He wasn't behaving like a child who had just gone through that kind of trauma. For a boy as young as him, they expected him to be terrified. When the police came around, he repeated the story to them, and it was so detailed that they believed him. However, they also noticed that he was unnaturally calm, and this led them to believe that he was suffering from shock. So he was handed over to a sheriff's investigator named Lucinda McKellar, who had experience working with children. Chris stayed with Lucinda throughout that afternoon. She also noticed and was impressed by how calm he was and how well he was handling the traumatic situation. During the afternoon with her, he played cards and watched TV with her. However, as the sun set onto the horizon, the truth began to come to light. The arson investigator on the case, Scott Williams, arrived that evening and questioned Chris extensively. It turned out that Chris had been lying all along about the kidnapping, about the big black man, and virtually everything. It turned out that 12-year-old Chris, armed with a shotgun, had crept into his grandparents' room 4 hours after his grandfather had given him a spanking for his outburst. Chris had shot them 4 times while they were sleeping, killing them instantly. It was he who had set the house on fire. He took the truck, guns, the family dog, and $33 in cash. The 12-year-old had just confessed to premeditated murder, theft, and arson. It was difficult to believe, and what made the situation worse was the fact that Christopher Pittman felt no remorse. To be sitting in a room with a 12-year-old boy that just killed his grandparents is one thing, and then to actually, hear him say, "I'm not sorry for what he had done to the people that he supposedly loved the most in his life," was pretty shocking. My God, and you don't want to believe it, but that's what he was telling us. Now, why on earth would a 12-year-old murder his grandparents that he obviously loved? Somehow, Chris's father felt that he had an answer to that question. According to him, the culprit was not his son, the true culprit was Zoloft. Yes, Zoloft, the antidepressant. And if you're wondering what an antidepressant has to do with a 12-year-old killing his grandparents in cold blood, then you are asking the right question, because this is where we fit all the last pieces into the puzzle of this tragic story. Let's retrace our steps to the first time Chris had a meltdown. This was after his father had taken him from his grandparents' home, and after his mother had once again abandoned him without warning. Around that time, we said that Chris experienced tantrums, and those tantrums devolved into depression. It was mild in the beginning, so doctors placed him on Paxil, an antidepressant. However, things got worse, and we talked about how he threatened to commit suicide if he wasn't allowed to return to his grandparents in South Carolina. His father agreed, and he was sent back to his grandparents. Now we're standing on thin ice. You see, in Chester, South Carolina, the drug Paxil was not available, so a doctor in the town prescribed Zoloft for him instead. Both drugs are SSRIs, which is a fancy name for classifying a group of drugs that are used as antidepressants in the treatment of major depressive disorders, anxiety disorders, and other psychological conditions. Paxil and Zoloft might have similar modes of selective action, but abruptly substituting one for the other is far from advisable. So when Chris switched to Zoloft, he might have suffered from Paxil withdrawal. He allegedly began to experience the negative side effects of the new medication. His older sister, Danielle, would testify that her brother complained of a burning sensation all over his body that required painkillers, and that he would often express volatile behavior to the point of becoming manic. And when the side effects were brought to the doctor's attention, what did they do? Well, they doubled his daily dosage from 100 milligrams to 200 milligrams. Now, most would just call this child a sick, twisted killer, but Chris's defense team believed that they had a reasonable explanation. They claimed this increased prescription might have been what led Pittman to choke a fellow student, and it might have been what caused the scene in church that led to his grandfather spanking him, and it might be the reason he murdered his grandparents in cold blood. This was the defense's argument when Chris's case was taken to the court 3 years after the crime was committed. Chris was arrested until he was 16, and then he was tried as an adult on the 31st of January 2005. During those 3 years, Chris's story started to change, but only slightly. He wasn't denying that he killed his grandparents, but he changed some details. He said that his grandfather did not spank him on that fateful evening, and that he killed him because he was under the influence of an overdose of Zoloft. Everyone in his family believed him, everyone from his older sister to his maternal grandmother to his own father. According to Chris, Zoloft had caused what a forensic psychiatrist would later call command hallucinations. In simpler terms, a voice instructed him to murder his grandparents. He said it was like a dream or television show that he couldn't turn off or stop watching. These voices in my head. And what were these voices saying? Kill them. The task of convincing the jury that Chris's crime was a result of the negative side effects of the drug fell on the defense, and they brought 2 scientists to back the claim. The first defense expert was a forensic psychiatrist named Lynette Atkins, who said that on the night Chris killed his grandparents, he was not in control. He was psychotic and heard command hallucinations that ordered him to pull the trigger and burn the house. She also said that his lack of emotions after the murder was yet another side effect of the medication. We must know Atkins, who evaluated juvenile suspects for the state of South Carolina at the time, had a history of testing on behalf of the prosecution, But in this case, she was on the other side of the fence, so it shocked everyone. The second expert witness that witnessed on behalf of the defense was Dr. Richard Caffin, a scientist who had worked for the FDA for 14 years and once approved Zoloft for human medical trials. Now, he believed that the medication could drastically change the behavior of some juveniles by causing chemically induced anger. Also, during the early period of his 3 years of incarceration before trial, another psychiatrist claimed that Pittman was still suffering from mania and used racial slurs on the prison guards. Every argument and evidence from the defense pointed to Zoloft as the true guilt of Chris's terrible crime. However, while the defense was working hard on the Zoloft case, the prosecution worked tirelessly to discredit it. Prosecutors blamed it all on meanness and a kid who was disciplined by his grandparents. They said only an adult-thinking criminal could plot, plan, and pull off such a horrible set of crimes because, remember, he didn't just kill his grandparents, he set their house on fire and came up with a fake story to hide his disgusting actions from authorities. The prosecution kept this in mind, and in efforts to prove the prescription drug played no role in the vile acts, they brought up evidence of volatile behavior that Chris had exhibited before he was introduced to any of the drugs. The defense either denied or waved it off as a boy being a boy. Then, the prosecution pointed out that Zoloft had been on the market since the early 90s and was the most prescribed antidepressant in America at the time. There was no other case where the drug had turned an individual into a monster. Then they brought their medical experts. A psychiatrist named James Bollinger said, and I quote, "There was no evidence that he wasn't thinking correctly. There was a lot of evidence that he knew what he had done was wrong." He also reminded the jury that Chris had thought out a means of escape by blaming the killings on a black man. Then another psychiatrist who had spoken to Chris hours after he confessed recalled how unremorseful Chris had been and how he brushed off his actions with the state. They asked for it. Then the final straw was when the prosecution called Vice President of Pfizer, Dr. Stephen Romano, to the stand, and he acknowledged that while their research showed some increased risk of aggression, there was no link to homicide. The judge called the defense aside and gave them an option of a plea deal that could see Pittman get a minimum sentence of 3 years, but they rejected it. The defense lawyers were convinced that the jury could not unanimously decide that Chris was guilty. On the 15th of February 2005, Pittman was convicted of murder and sentenced to 30 years in prison. But was this justice? Eventually, after Chris pleaded guilty on the 11th of June 2007, he was convicted of 2 counts of voluntary manslaughter and will become a free man in 2023 at the age of just 34.